I'm making this program a few hours before French President Macron will address the French people on national television to discuss the situation in Ukraine. Yesterday, the French National Assembly ratified the security agreement between France and Ukraine, and the universal expectation is that despite apparently strong opposition from within the French military, wide opposition across French society, strong opposition from all the parties represented in the French National Assembly, except those that essentially make up the governing coalition. President Macron is going to announce troop deployments to Ukraine. Supposedly, allegedly, they will not be deployed in a combat role. The assumption that many are making is that they will take positions, various points across Ukraine, relieving Ukrainian troops who will then be redeployed to the battlefronts to make up the numbers there. For which all I can say is, I wonder whether those Ukrainian troops who would be redeployed in that kind of way would be happy at that prospect. But anyway, I am not going to debate French intentions until we have a little more clarity as to what they are precisely going to do. Anyway, on that issue, President Putin of Russia has given an enormous interview to the head of Россия Сегодня, the Russian media, the state-owned media complex, in which he discusses many topics. I'm going to come to this interview in a moment, but anyway, over the course of that interview, Putin, in effect, responds to the suggestion of what will happen if French troops, or indeed NATO troops, are deployed to Ukraine. And he makes it crystal clear that if that does happen, then the Russians will treat those troops as, in effect, enemy combatants, and that there is no question in that case that the Russian army, the Russian military, would be prepared to take action against them. He also says a very striking thing. He says that if they have no red lines with respect to Russia, then Russia, of course, will have no red lines with respect to them. He also discusses at very considerable length the fact that nothing that these troops will do will change the direction of the military operation, and that as far as he's concerned, and as far as the Russians are concerned, they are ready for these French troops or these NATO troops if they arrive. He also, by the way, discusses what might happen if Polish troops also enter Ukraine, and suggests that in that event we're likely to see a carve-up of Ukraine, because it's most unlikely that the Polish troops entering historic Polish territory would ever choose to leave. Anyway, these are, by the way, the exact words of Putin's with respect to how the Russians would react in the event that Western troops from France were to enter Ukraine. He says, as for states saying that they have no red lines with Russia, they should realize that Russia will have no red lines with them either. perfectly clear, and there is no equivocation at all about it. What Macron is doing, whether he realizes the fact or not, is that he is putting French troops, if he really does choose to send them, he's putting those French troops in the line of Russian fire. And over the course of the interview, Putin again pointedly reminded everybody that Russia has enormously powerful nuclear forces. He denies categorically that he has ever, at any point in the special military operation up to now, even ever considered using tactical nuclear weapons or any sort of nuclear weapons. He rejects the suggestion outright that he thought of using tactical nuclear weapons at the time of the withdrawals from Kharkiv region and Kherson region in autumn 2022. He seemed to suggest, by the way, that those withdrawals in military terms were no big deal. And he went on to say, however, that if NATO deployments really did challenge Russia's statehood, if it really did become an existential threat, then, of course, as he put it, Russian nuclear weapons are there to be used. They would be used in the event that there was a real danger to Russia. And he made another very telling point over the course of this interview. He said that NATO leaders need to remember that for Russia, this war is an existential war. It is about Russia's survival as a state. He spoke about what might have happened to Russia if the Russians had simply submitted to Western demands. He said that Russia would descend, might break up, or would become at best a third or fourth rank country. It would enter into an inexorable decline. And he said that therefore for the Russians, the war is an existential issue, whereas for the Western powers, it is essentially a strategic play, a geostrategic play. And so given that for the Russians, the stakes are so much greater, the Russians, if pushed, will have to take stronger action than the West is probably ever prepared itself to take. So that was a very strong response from Putin in response to the actions that Macron is likely to announce. French troops entering Ukraine, as I said, are entering the line of fire. And as I said, he made that crystal clear. Putin made that crystal clear in this interview he gave to Sergei Kiselyov. Now, I'm going to add that there is a long discussion over the course of the interview as to Macron's motives, and Putin, and by the way, to some extent Kiselyov, appeared to agree that this is all a hissy fit. It's the product of a hissy fit by Macron, because the French have seen their influence in West Africa collapse, and they're exasperated and angry because the former French colonies in West Africa, countries like Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali, are now realigning with Russia. But Putin carefully made the point that this is an issue that he's discussed with Macron in person. He's tried to get Macron to understand that this is not something that the Russians have directly engineered. They did not go out to drive the French from Africa. That is something the Africans have done themselves. And if the Africans, having done that, make a decision that they also want friendship with Russia and good security arrangements with Russia, well, that is a matter for them, not for Russia and not for France. I'm going to say this: if it is indeed the case that Macron's actions are actually driven by some sort of crazy peak he feels because of what's happened in Burkina Faso and Niger, then not only does that seem to me, reckless and entitled beyond belief, but it also suggests an astonishing inability by Macron to engage in any degree of self-reflection, because Niger and Burkina Faso and West Africa are hardly existentially important to France. Ukraine, by contrast, is existentially important to Russia, and Ukraine and Russia were united as a single state for 300 years. So, if Macron is angry about what happened in West Africa, perhaps he should take a step back and think how much more angry the Russians must be about what the Western powers, including, by the way, France, have done in Ukraine. It's something that Westerners never do. They get furious when they see the Russians encroaching on what they see as their sphere of influence. But when it comes to the Russians, of course, not only are not entitled to a sphere of influence, they're not even entitled to make decisions about their own security, about whether, in fact, the presence of NATO troops and in Ukraine might affect their security, whether Ukrainian membership of NATO might affect their security, and take steps accordingly. It's this incredible blindness, born of extreme entitlement and arrogance, which I think explains an awful lot of the problems which we have seen develop over the last 30 plus years since the Soviet Union collapsed. And I would argue, actually, that in terms of Russian-Western relations, they go back much further. Having said that, I am not wholly convinced that Macron's actions really are motivated so much by the events in West Africa. Yesterday, I discussed the article in Marianne, the studies done by the French military, the fact that the French military are reporting to Macron that Ukraine is not only losing the war, but that there is nothing that the Western powers can realistically do to reverse that. That, I think, is almost certainly the major motivator in Macron taking the decisions that he has taken. He's had multiple rebuffs from Putin over many issues, over many years. It's clear that Macron finds the idea of Putin, in the end, triumphing in this war unendurable. In fact, I remember that at one point, fairly early on, Macron, after the special military operation began, seemed to think that he would be in a position to act as some kind of mediator between the West and the Russians, though the mediation that he had in mind was one whereby the Russians basically capitulated to the Western powers. And he seems to have been very angry that Putin, unsurprisingly, rejected that and basically froze Macron out of future discussions. Anyway, I suspect that is probably what is driving Macron more than the events in West Africa. But that, of course, doesn't make his actions in Ukraine any the less dangerous. Dangerous first and foremost to France itself. Anyway, I'm going to return to this issue of what Macron is going to do and what the Russian reaction is going to be. In my program tomorrow, I think we need to know exactly what Macron is going to say in his address this evening. Quite plausibly, you will know before this video appears, because of course there's always a time lag between my making the video and the video being published on our various platforms, and especially and including YouTube. But anyway, as I said, I, at this moment in time, do not definitely know what Macron is going to say. I fear the worst, but I'm going to wait to discuss that in more detail tomorrow, and maybe we'll try to get some sense of his overall plans. And I predict, if things are really moving in the direction that they seem to be, that we will be making a dedicated program to this topic on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I. But in the meantime, let me say very clearly and very simply, Putin has given the French, has given Macron clear warning: if you are foolish enough to send your troops into Ukraine, then as far as we are concerned, their competence, even if they're not entering the combat line, if their job is to release Ukrainian soldiers so that they can enter the combat line where they can kill Russians, well, that makes the French troops in Ukraine competent, and the Russians will not hesitate to strike at these troops. And as far as they're concerned, just as the French say that there are no red lines with Russia, the Russians are saying there are no red lines on the part of Russia towards the French. The French must not make the mistake of thinking, if they enter Ukraine, that simply because they are French and are Western troops, the Russians won't strike at them. Anyway, let's move on and discuss firstly what's going on the battlefronts, and then I'm going to return to Putin's interview, and then there's a number of other interesting developments going on, which I'm also going to talk about later in this program. But let's first of all discuss what is happening on the battlefronts. And the first thing to say is that Ukraine, despite experiencing a massive disaster in its attempts to send troops across the Russian border in Kursk and Belgorod region, appears to be persisting in these efforts today. And all of the reports up to the moment of the making of this video tell the same story, that these attacks across the border are being repelled by the Russians, with the Ukrainians suffering appalling losses, and that the fighting is turning out into another horrible disaster for the Ukrainians. I say for the Ukrainians, though some of the troops that might have been deployed by the Ukrainians are dissident Russians. Now, I have had another one of these extraordinary and very revealing emails from one of my sources. This person has been in contact with some very well-informed people in Russia. I have some idea who those people in Russia are, and if they're providing this information, I believe it to be, well, reasonably accurate. I say reasonably because I'm nonetheless getting this information at third hand. But anyway, this is what I'm being told. Firstly, it seems that these units, these dissident Russian units, were trained in this operation by members of the French Foreign Legion. And some of these men from the French Foreign Legion who provided this training are Ukrainians or Russians who, of course, serve in the French Foreign Legion. So they were providing training to these troops. It was partly, apparently, that suggests, it was partly a French planned operation. And what I'm hearing from this source about this operation is indeed remarkable, and again shows how utterly reckless both the authorities in Kiev and, one must say, the Macron government appear to be becoming. Of course, all of this on the assumption that this is true. Anyway, the account I've heard is that there were supposed to be incursions along the border. The expectation was that these troops that were entering the border from Ukraine would capture some villages and would try to occupy these villages. The further assumption was that the Russians would then rush troops to drive these invading forces from those villages, that would open a gap in the Russian defense lines within Russia itself, that the Ukrainians would then send a special forces unit, about company strength, around 100 people, towards a supposed nuclear arms dump near Belgorod region, and they would capture this nuclear arms dump and the nuclear weapons that were stored in it, and that this would then be used in order to blackmail the Russian government. I have to say, this seems like a crazy plan to me, and I do wonder whether the Russians really are keeping nuclear weapons so close to the combat line. And I also suspect, by the way, that if they are, those weapons are very securely guarded by large numbers of highly trained Russian troops. And I think that the Russians, in any operation, in any situation of this kind, even if it had been successful in its first moments, even if some villages had been captured, they would not fall for the bait. They would keep those troops that were guarding that facility there and might even send more troops to reinforce it. But anyway, I'm told that this was the plan. The problem is that the Russians got wind of it and were prepared. And the result was that these units that were trying to break into Kursk and Belgorod region found the Russians ready in overwhelming force, and they got smashed. And the last part of this, I think we can say definitely, is certainly true. When I say that, I don't want to say that I don't think that the attack on the nuclear facility was untrue. It's exactly the kind of thing that the Ukrainians and I suspect Macron might decide to do. But the attack, as I said, on the villages, the Russians definitely were prepared for. And the Ukrainians got smashed. And they are continuing to be smashed today. Now, Putin discussed it over the course of his interview with Kiselyov, this particular incident. And he said, over the course of the interview with Kiselyov, that the Ukrainians had lost 7 tanks and 7 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. And there's a curious discrepancy because in its Russian report, it's in its reports published in Russian, the Russian Defense Ministry is also saying that 7 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles were destroyed over the course of this operation, whereas in the English language reports, the Russian Defense Ministry says that it was only 3. I suspect that it was 7, and it's just that the English report has not yet been updated. Anyway, very heavy losses by the Ukrainians, suffered by the Ukrainians as a result of this operation. But as of this morning, they are still persisting. They continue to send more men and machines, trying desperately to capture these villages, presumably trying to retrieve something from this operation before Sunday's presidential election in Russia. And as I said, all of the attacks so far are being repelled and they are experiencing heavy losses. And just to repeat a point I made yesterday, these big Ukrainian drone attacks that have taken place across Russia over the last 36, 48 hours, they were clearly timed to happen alongside these attacks on the border. Those attacks, those drone attacks, they don't seem to have hit any significant targets. The Russians seem to have been successful in bringing down the vast majority of these drones. I've seen photographs of some of the drones that were brought down. They look to be much simpler and more like homemade affairs. They don't seem to me to resemble in any meaningful way the more sophisticated and more refined Russian Uranium-2 drones. But anyway, I'm not going to dedicate time to that. But anyway, the drone attacks have been essentially unsuccessful. They managed to strike some Russian oil refineries, and there have been some fires in oil refineries. There have been all sorts of claims that oil refineries across Russia have been destroyed as a result of these attacks. Again, this is an area about which I have some knowledge. I think that people who make those claims know very little indeed about oil refineries. Crude oil in particular is not a particularly inflammable material. These oil refineries are generally a very large industrial facilities. Yes, you would do a certain amount of damage, a small amount of damage. You might cause a few fires here and there, but you are not going to inflict real damage on big oil refineries of the kind that these drones are hitting. If you were able to strike these oil refineries with cruise missiles, with big, powerful cruise missiles, or were able to bomb these refineries, then of course it would be different. But these are truly insignificant pinprick attacks. They're not going to have any significant effect on the Russian oil industry whatsoever. Just saying. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, these attacks continue. They will no doubt continue in some form until Sunday. But so far, the Russians are fully on top of what is happening. And the Ukrainians made a major slip yesterday when they persisted in claims that a particular village, Russian village, had in fact been captured and occupied. They purported to release a video from some of the supposed dissident Russian soldiers made in this village. The soldiers say that they are in the village and that they are in complete control of the village. There is film and photographs and reports from the village itself which contradict this, and people who are skilled at this sort of thing have actually managed to geolocate the place where this specific video was made to a village in Ukraine, a village some distance away, in other words, from where this fighting was actually happening. So this was a staged event, and the claims made in it straightforwardly were fake. Anyway, I think that was a big blunder, by the way. I think the Ukrainians would have been much better advised to say as little about this event as possible. Anyway, this is obviously something that is happening. These attacks on Kursk and Belgorod regions, we're likely to see more attacks over the next couple of days, at least until the election is out of the way, perhaps even beyond that. The Ukrainians losing large numbers of men, hundreds of men in this operation. 243, the Russian Defense Ministry said in its report yesterday, 243 men killed. Probably more since then. They're also losing large quantities of valuable equipment, tanks and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and so far they've achieved nothing. But it remains, in military terms, a sideshow. The real fighting continues in Donbas. And here we're now getting more news, more information about what is going on. Firstly, we've had some reports from the Avdiivka area, and I think some reports understates it. It looks as if these are in fact correct reports, but it does look as if the Russians are now essentially in control of the village of Orlovka. There was intense fighting by the Ukrainians to hold on to parts of this village, but the Russians now seem to have cleared most of the village. There may be a few houses that the Ukrainians still have, but Orlovka, to all intents and purposes, now looks to be under Russian control. And of the three villages in the Avdiivka area where the Ukrainians have set up their current defense line, Orlovka, Berdichi, and Tonenka. Orlovka, as I've said, in terms of this defense line, is the most important, because if the Russians consolidate control of Orlovka and are able to push the Ukrainians out of Orlovka and consolidate control of this village, then the entire defense line collapses. The Ukrainians will be forced to withdraw from both Berdichi and Tonenka further south. And if Tonenka falls, then a whole lot of other villages to the southwest of Tonenka collapse as well. So Orlovka is important. Anyway, those are the reports that I'm hearing now. I ought to say that we've also had a report about the level of forces that Syrskyi has committed to trying to hold back the Russian advance in the Avdiivka area. And according to these reports, around 9 brigades of the Ukrainian army are now committed to the defense of this line in Avdiivka. It is a disproportionate share of the Ukrainian army, and it perhaps explains why the Ukrainians have been able to hold on to this line, Avdiivka, Tonenka, Orlovka, and Berdichi, for about 2 weeks now, and to hold the Russians there. But it also explains the very heavy casualties that the Ukrainians continue to suffer in this area. Around 460 men, according to the last Russian Defense Ministry update. So what is happening is that exactly as he did in the Battle of Bakhmut, Syrskyi is sacrificing a large part of the Ukrainian army, in some would say the best part of the Ukrainian army, to defend, in this case, some villages. It doesn't seem to me a very logical trade-off. Well, having mentioned Bakhmut, there's been actually less information about what is going on that battlefront. It seems that the Russians now do control certainly the greater part of Ivanivska, but many commentators have been saying that there's an important hill position to the northwest of Ivanivska that the Russians need to capture in order to consolidate and complete their capture of Ivanivska before they advance to Chasiv Yar. Apparently the Russians are bombing Ukrainian positions on that hill intensively, and the assumption must be that the Russians will soon launch an attack on this hill as well, at which point the Battle of Ivanivska will be over and the bigger battle for Chasiv Yar will begin. Now, there has been, over the last few hours, circulating all over the internet, an astonishing video of an interview with the American historian, military historian, David Glantz. Now, David Glantz is a legendary figure for everybody who has studied or has any interest in the Russian military, because apparently, at the request of the Pentagon, he initiated in the 1970s, a succession of colossal studies into the Soviet military. These gained extra traction in the 1990s as after the Soviet Union collapsed and it became that the Soviet archives became more accessible. And anyway, in summary, David Glantz revolutionized understanding of the Second World War, of the Eastern Front, explaining how the Russians, the Soviet Union, conducted the war on the Eastern Front, and basically dispelled many of the vast array of myths that had been accumulating over the decades following the end of the Second World War, based principally on German memoirs of that war. And it was eye-opening studies. His most famous book is When Titans Clash, which you can be bought on Amazon, on Amazon Kindle, but he's also supplemented that book with a whole series of studies of individual battles that took place during the Second World War. He studied specific battles in extraordinary detail, fought by the Red Army to a level that has never happened before. Now, David Glantz is one of those experts about Russian military affairs and Soviet military affairs who I would have thought would have been consulted all but immediately once it became clear that the West was committing to supporting Ukraine in the conflict with Russia. I don't know whether or not he has been consulted, but my impression from watching this video is that he has not been. Just saying. Anyway, he says some very interesting things. Firstly, he is probably the best informed scholar in the West about the Battle of Donbas, which took place in this precise area, the Donbas, in 1943, between the Soviet Red Army and the Germans. And he discusses in this video Bakhmut specifically. And he says that Bakhmut is one of the most important, strategically important locations in Donbas. We've been hearing read article after article, commentary after commentary in the Western media about how unimportant Bakhmut is. It's a strategically irrelevant place. Now, I've pushed back on that in several videos. I've suggested that Bakhmut actually does matter strategically, that it is clearly at the hub of a very important road and railway network that ties together Ukrainian defences in central Donbas, that if the Russians not only capture Bakhmut, which of course they did in May last year, but are able to consolidate control of Bakhmut, then over time, the entire Ukrainian defense system in Donbas will start to unravel. Well, according to David Glantz, the Germans in 1943 took exactly that view. In fact, Bakhmut became the linchpin of their defense in Donbas, and Field Marshal Manstein, the German military commander in this area, actually set up his headquarters there. It was his main fortified position in Donbas. And apparently it was such a tough proposition for the Red Army to capture it that they didn't in fact do that. Apparently they won the Battle of Donbas by attacking in other places. So all those things that you've been hearing about the irrelevance of Bakhmut, the fact that it's only of symbolic significance, well, the best qualified Western expert has a different view. Just saying. Anyway, Glantz went on to say something else. He said that Donbas is terrible tank country. Again, he quoted the experiences of Red Army commanders at that time. He spoke in this video about the soft ground, the fact that this place is interspersed by small streams and rivers and canals, that the ground is soft and damp, that it's difficult, therefore, for tanks to maneuver. He also mentioned that in places it is very heavily forested. It is, in fact, and this is Glantz's words, terrible tank country. And I'm going to suggest that since the 1940s, since the Second World War, it's probably become, in some ways, even worse tank country than it was then. Because, of course, since 1943, industrial development by the Soviet Union in Donbas will have been very extensive. And this might make movement in some respects easier, in that there are undoubtedly more metalled roads in Donbas. But of course, in addition to that, there are probably the populated areas have grown in size and have become, have taken up more of the landscape. And of course, they too work against the easy movement of armoured forces, the easy manoeuvre of armoured forces in this area. So, again, according to Glantz, the most qualified expert in the West, the terrain of Donbas itself imposes the kind of attritional warfare that the Russians have been conducting there. Now, all of that is revelatory, not because it's been difficult to work this out from observing the war, but because there's always been that person, the single best expert, who was there to explain it right at the outset. And before this video was made, in, I believe, May 2023, no one, as far as I can see, sought to consult him. I find this lack of consultation with the experts entirely beyond understanding. And, well, we've had further examples of why advice from experts might have been useful before the West plunged in and started supplying Ukraine with all the weapons that we've seen and which Ukraine has used in the war. Now, I spoke recently about a video which has appeared of a Challenger 2 tank, which became bogged down. It sank in the ground, the soft ground in Ukraine. What I hadn't realized about that video is that it was made by the Sun newspaper, a tabloid newspaper in Britain. And what the Sun did was that they sent a party of their people to Ukraine to find out how well the British tanks were doing. And the Ukrainian soldiers who are training on these tanks and who have care of them were obviously under very strict instructions to tell the British, to give the British the most positive spin on the use of the Challenger 2s. But even those soldiers couldn't hide certain fundamental facts about the Challenger 2s. Firstly, they are much too heavy. Now, again, I can remember saying this right at the outset when the West started thinking about supplying tanks to Ukraine. They are much too heavy for this landscape. They're heavy, they're underpowered, they're not maneuverable or mobile across country, not in the way that the Russian tanks are. They're fragile. They are constantly prone to mechanical breakdowns, and the maintenance of these tanks is more than the Ukrainians can remotely hope to cope with, which is why only 7 of the 14 tanks that have been delivered are currently in an operational condition. And the famous video of the tank, the Challenger 2, sinking into the mud, that happened when the British team asked to be taken on a training exercise, and they hopped on this tank, and the tank moved across the countryside, the wet countryside, probably not in Donbas, by the way, but somewhere else in Ukraine, the soft earth, and to everybody's embarrassment, the tank hit a ditch and promptly sank and had to be pulled out after a lot of trouble by another tank, something which would be a disaster, obviously, if it happened on the front lines. So, many problems with the Challenger 2s. The accompanying article by the Sun, the one that accompanies this video, is fascinating because it's quite clear that the soldiers are telling things which are either unlikely to be true or obviously untrue. For example, they say that the tank is being used as some kind of long-range artillery. It might have been true briefly during the fighting around Robotino in the summer of 2023, but I doubt that it has been true to any extent over the last few months. If it were true, I'm sure the Russians would have identified and spotted these tanks. And there are no reports from the Russians that that has happened. But there was one particular claim, which I am sure is not true, a whopper, if you like, whereby the Ukrainians say that on a number of occasions, Challenger 2s, apparently without ammunition, because they don't have ammunition which could be used to attack infantry positions. Anyway, Challenger 2s have lumbered towards Russian trenches, unarmed apparently, and they're so terrifying to the Russians that the Russians have turned and fled. Now, that story, I think, is absurd, and it's quite astonishing to see how the British journalists nonetheless appear to believe it. Anyway, there we go. So we see Glantz saying that Bakhmut, a strategically important place, and that is why there is so much fighting going on around it. And he also confirms a lot about the points that have been made by myself and others about the difficulty in the terrain in this area, why maneuver warfare is extremely difficult. The terrain does not really allow for it. And to say this again, once the Russians complete the battle for Donbas, the same geographical limitations do not reproduce themselves in the same way in other parts of Ukraine. Anyway, so fighting continuing in Ivanivska, in the Bakhmut area, Russian advances in the Avdiivka area with Orlovka. After a lot of Ukrainian counterattacks, the Russians seem to be consolidating their positions now in Orlovka. And the big events, however, continue to happen south of Avdiivka, between Avdiivka and Marinka. There are now accumulating reports that the Ukrainians are pulling troops out of Krasnogorovka. It seems that even Syrskyi understands that with the fall of Nivolskoye, Krasnogorovka is becoming undefendable. And there are also reports that the Russians have made further advances in Pervomaisky, the two key towns that I discussed yesterday. So Pervomaisky and Krasnogorovka, the situation there looking critically bad for the Ukrainians. And there's been fighting, of course, in other places. There are reports that the Russians have largely completed the capture of the village of Georgievka, east of Marinka, and they now seem to be very close to completing the fighting in Novomikhailovka. The fighting in Novomikhailovka seems to be more focused at the moment, not on the capture of the remaining buildings in the western part of Novomikhailovka, where the Ukrainians are still present, but in capturing various fields and dacha settlements to the west of Novomikhailovka, and the Russians seem to be well on the way to doing that. So at some point, probably in the next few weeks, week or so, 2 weeks, we will have probably news that Novomikhailovka, Georgievka, Krasnogorovka, Permovmaisky, and Ivanivska have all fallen. And, well, at that point, the situation for Ukraine will become worse still. Now, there are all sorts of other incidents taking place across the battlefronts. It went completely overlooked yesterday, but yesterday the Russian Defense Ministry claimed, and these claims perhaps should be taken seriously, that another Patriot missile launcher was destroyed by the Russians, this time in Kharkiv region. I don't know how many Patriot missile launchers Ukraine still has left, but the number must by now be severely depleted. The Russians have been hunting Patriot missile launchers with great effectiveness over the last few weeks, and it's clear to me that Ukraine's air defense system is being incrementally taken apart. And we also had another actually bizarre incident, which is that south of Marinka, in southern Donetsk region, to the extent that I can understand, the Russians discovered that the Ukrainians had established a small helicopter base dangerously close to the combat lines. And there were 3 Mi-17 helicopters located at this base. Now, these helicopters were Russian manufactured helicopters, which the Russians sold to the United States and which were intended for supply by the United States to the Afghan government army, the government army in Afghanistan that collapsed during the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in 2021. Now, after that happened, the United States found itself in possession of these Mi-17 helicopters, and it donated them to Ukraine, which had by this point run through most of its legacy helicopters left over from the time of the Soviet Union. And to the extent that Ukraine has a helicopter fleet, it appears to consist of what is left of that delivery of Mi-17s from the United States. I don't know how many of these helicopters Ukraine still has, but I guess around a dozen, perhaps a score. Anyway, 3 of them were there in this small base, not so far from the contact line. It would be interesting to know what the Ukrainians were intending to do with them, but apparently there were air-to-ground missiles deployed in a nearby building. So presumably the intention was that they would be used in some ground strike role, which, by the way, is not what these rather large, bulky helicopters are designed for. But anyway, I'm not going to discuss that. Anyway, the Russians found this base. They attacked the base with drones. 2 helicopters were destroyed. 3rd seems to have been damaged. There's some reports that it got away, others that it was also shot down. The Ukrainians managed to get the missiles taken off the helicopters and moved to a nearby building. The Russians kept track of that. The Russians sent the Sukhoi 34. The Sukhoi 34 dropped a bomb. The building was destroyed with all the missiles. An odd incident, I suspect the kind that is not uncommon in war. But again, it seems that since Syrskyi has taken over, the Ukrainians are putting more and more of their ever-diminishing stock of valuable assets dangerously close to the combat line where the Russians are able to destroy them. I'm not going to discuss the tactics of this. I've discussed them in other programs. Lastly, there are further reports that the Russians have now gained control of around 80% of Rabotino in the Zaporozhye region. And again, there are claims that the Ukrainians are planning to pull their forces back ultimately, first to Orechov and then to fortified lines that they're creating north of Orechov in order to try to protect the city of the great industrial city of Zaporozhye further north. Now, the Ukrainians are active in other areas. There continue to be all kinds of mysterious operations going on the Dnieper River. There continue to be speculations that the Ukrainians are planning some kind of amphibious assault on the Kinburn Spit at the mouth of the Dnieper River. We'll just have to wait and see. They've been busy shelling again the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. That has again led to speculation that they might be planning some kind of strike to try to capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. That seems to me, again, a wild and reckless plan, almost certain to miscarry. If Ukrainian attempts to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in the autumn of 2022, when the Russians were relatively weak, failed disastrously, then how are they going to succeed now when the Russians are so much stronger? But anyway, the Ukrainians are busy doing all of these things. And we've now had further reports from the United States. There was a report, I believe it was in Politico, about drones, Ukrainian drones. I've said in certain programs that I was doing at the time of the Avdiivka battles that it looked to me as if the Russians were getting on top of the problem posed by the FPV drones, that there were fewer and fewer drone strikes by the Ukrainians, and that by contrast, Russian kamikaze drone strikes seem to be increasing in number. Anyway, there's apparently been some kind of a military conference discussing the drone war, and over the course of it, one of the participants blurted out that Russian electronic jamming has now become so intense and so sophisticated across the battlefronts that the Russians bring down, with electronic jamming, around 80% of Ukraine's kamikaze drones. And they've been able to perfect their jamming so that at the same time it doesn't interfere with the work of Russia's own drones. So the Russians, over the last few weeks, as I've discussed, seem to have been targeting successfully Ukrainian FPV drone operators and been killing a significant number of them, and they're successfully jamming the drones as well. And at the same time, their own use of these sorts of drones is increasing at an accelerated rate. So, into the midst of this gathering military disaster, and contrary to the advice of his military people, President Macron appears willing, heedless of the warnings he's getting from President Putin, to commit the French forces. He says they won't have a combat role. The Russians beg to differ. In that interview with Sergei Kiselyov that I discussed, Putin actually said that as far as the Russians are concerned, any NATO troops that enter Ukraine will not only be perceived as combatants and therefore as a legitimate target, but given the state of the war and given Russian history with Ukraine, the Russians will actually treat these Western soldiers as invaders. He was very careful to use that specific word. So that is what Macron apparently proposes to do. Now, I have a contact who was a former French military officer, and I intend to be discussing these plans of Macron with him fairly soon. I've also been reviewing the balance of the French army, and there is no doubt that French soldiers are brave and highly trained, but the French army does not seem to me to be up to taking on the Russian army, either in terms of its size or in terms of its equipment. As we've seen, Western equipment has not performed well in Ukraine, in Ukrainian conditions, and it's likely that it would still run into problems even if Western soldiers were trying to operate it. And besides, French formations are too light. They're too lightly armed to take on the Russians in a war of this kind. Now, they would also be lacking in air cover. Now, France does have a potent air force, but French aircraft operating over Ukraine would run into many of the same problems I suspect that we're going to see with the F-16s. Ukrainian runways are not in a condition to operate, to allow these French jets to operate. You could do it from Poland or Romania, but would the Poles and the Romanians agree to the French using their aircraft in that sort of way? And would the French aircraft, which are not, by the way, stealth aircraft, would they be in a position to take on the Russians? Now, yesterday I discussed certain commentaries that a person formerly in a NATO military has provided me with, explaining the superiority, the decisive superiority that the Western powers have in air warfare over the Russians. Yesterday, however, after that video was published, I received a lengthy comment from a former Air Force officer in a Western military. I am not going to identify this person. I'm not going to provide any more information about this person. Anyway, suffice to say that this person basically disagreed. Firstly, it's clear that only the United States is really in a position to take on the Russian Air Force. This person also went into discussions about the relative capabilities of Russian and Western aircraft, and he explained both the strengths and limitations of the very expensive stealth fighters that the United States operates, and he was skeptical about some of the claimed numbers of these fighters. I think that is fair to say. He doesn't exactly put it like that, but the numbers he gave for the number of stealth fighter jets the US could deploy are very, very, very significantly lower than those of my previous commentator. He also made points that Russian air-to-air missiles are more long-range and that Russian jets, including their stealth fighter jets, the Sukhoi 57s, are far more maneuverable than Western aircraft. And he explained the reason for that, which is that it's not really for dogfighting, which doesn't take place much anymore, but super maneuverability enables Russian aircraft, or makes it easier for Russian aircraft to dodge air-to-air missiles, which some Western fighter jets, which are less maneuverable, would have more difficulty doing. And this person also, I think, rated the Russian air defense system rather more highly than my previous commentator did. But all right, there are these differences between these commentators, but both ultimately come down to the same view, same point. In both cases, if we got into a situation of an aerial clash between the United States and the Russians over Ukraine, well, we are looking at World War III. And this latest person made points about certain things that the Russians could do, short of using nuclear weapons. I find it very uncomfortable to debate these sort of scenarios, but I can see the logic of a lot of what he says. And frankly, I don't think that the battle in the air would be quite as weighted towards the West as my previous commentator thought, not on the basis of what this person is saying. But I come back to my underlying point, which has been reinforced by Putin's latest warnings and his interview. I cannot see how this kind of aerial clash can take place without, at some point, nuclear weapons being used. Just saying. And of course, if nuclear weapons are used, each side might say initially to itself that they're only using them on a tactical basis, but we are then on a ladder of nuclear escalation, which, well, heaven knows where it might lead. These are cataclysmic scenarios. We should not even be debating them. The fact that Macron is lurching into this situation, I cannot imagine that the United States, that the Pentagon is pleased. Putting aside all that I said, would they really be willing or happy to risk much of their precious fleet of super expensive stealth fighter jets to bail Macron out of trouble? This at a time when China is building up its fleet of stealth fighters in the Pacific. I think that the Americans, the military in the United States, must be privately furious with Macron. There's been an echoing silence from the United States in response to what Macron is doing. And far from placing himself at the head of some great Western coalition against Russia, he is now, or recklessly, or so it seems to me, pushing France further and further out on an increasingly extremely dangerous limb. Now, whatever he does, it's not going to solve or resolve the underlying dynamics on the battlefield. This is what Putin also said in his lengthy interview with Sergei Kiselyov. The Russian military is getting stronger, and by the way, Putin provided some figures for the actual share of the defense industry in Russian GDP. I'm not, by the way, sure what GDP calculations he's using. I am going to guess, by the way, that it could even be nominal GDP rather than purchasing power parity GDP. Just saying, because this is based on budget numbers. But he said that last year, in 2023, defense procurement accounted for around 4% of GDP. This year, it's going to go higher to 6.8%. That is still lower than virtually every other estimate I've seen in the West. They range from 7% to 7.5% to 8%. One figure I saw was 10%. And my impression, by the way, is that Putin expects that the share of defense in Russia's GDP mix after this year is going to fall. That this is going to be the year of largest and heaviest procurement by the Russian military. They'll get the shells and the missiles and the tanks that they need to complete the special military operation, and that he is looking forward to declines after this year. He may very well be right. But anyway, Putin provided information about that, but he also spoke about a strengthening Russian military, about the Russians continuing their advances, and he seemed confident that whatever the West does, whatever the Macron gets up to, the Russians can deal with it and will do so, and will see the special military operation through. Now, Putin also discussed at length the topic of negotiations. And he said over the course of this interview that now that Ukraine is losing the war, there are attempts being made by the Western powers, at least some people in the West, to, as Putin put it, lure Russia into agreements. And Putin said some very interesting things about this. Firstly, he spoke about the long record of Western broken promises, about the promise not to extend NATO East. They extended NATO East. The promise to seek an internal resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. They sabotaged the Minsk agreement. He spoke a lot about that. In a most telling phrase, he said to Sergei Kiselyov that he doesn't trust anyone. He kept it open. He might have been referring, as Kiselyov asked him, generically to everyone. But it was clear that he didn't trust, that the people that he wasn't trusting were the West. And Putin also said that those people who are now coming to the Russians, urging the Russians to enter into negotiations, are extremely dangerous people. They're more dangerous in some respects for the Russians than those who straightforwardly want to go on supporting the war and fighting in Ukraine, because there's a risk that they might trick the Russians into agreeing to things that are not in the Russians' interest. And he said that, yes, the Russians are prepared to listen and to talk, but it is absurd for them simply to enter into negotiations because the other side is short of ammunition. He actually said that. He actually said precisely this, that it is absurd for the Russians to stop simply because the other side is short of ammunition. And in all truth, the impression I got is that Putin felt that there was no agreements, no proposals that the West could make which would satisfy his very steep conditions, which is that there have to be unbreakable, concrete assurances for the Russians that their security interests in Ukraine will not be affected. And he said things, for example, that there mustn't be a pause, which would simply allow the West to rearm Ukraine. And Kiselyov asked him, well, what agreements can we reach with the Western powers which we can trust them to honor? And I noticed that Putin didn't really answer that question. We see how catastrophic the legacy of mistrust now is, and the depth of Putin's mistrust towards the West. There's been one other significant piece of news. Recently, China, Switzerland, Turkey have been trying to get the Western powers and the Ukrainians to agree to an invitation being sent to the Russians to attend the next in the series of Copenhagen process discussions which Jake Sullivan initiated in the summer, in August, supposedly to discuss President Zelensky's non-peace peace plan. Zelensky rejected the suggestion that an invitation be extended to the Russians outright. He did that to the obvious fury of President Erdogan. And I gather that that still remains the position of the Western powers. It's gone unnoticed, but the Russian Foreign Ministry has now said that even if the Russians received such an invitation to the next Copenhagen process meeting, which is due to take place in Switzerland, they will not attend. The reason they're giving is that as far as they're concerned, Switzerland, which has sided with Ukraine, is no longer a neutral country. But the very fact that the Russians are talking in this way, combined with what Putin says, makes me question whether the Russians really believe that a negotiated settlement of this crisis is possible at all. Now that then throws open the question of what settlement the Russians do ultimately envisage for Ukraine. Well, Putin isn't saying very much about this. In the interview with Kiselyov, he avoided that discussion. But Dmitry Medvedev, always the archhawk, always the most demonstrative, did say something about that in one of his perennial messages. In his very latest message, published today, he spoke about a rather elaborate process, new government in Kiev, all sorts of steps to sort out and eradicate the influence of the regime in Ukraine and its noxious ideology, and all of that. But he also appears to imply that all of this should be done as part of a process for complete reunification of Ukraine and Russia. Now, could that be where we're heading? Perhaps, possibly, we shall see. But to repeat again, the information from the battlefronts is grave. The Czechs are now saying that if they do manage somehow to buy shells on the international arms market, Ukraine isn't going to see any of them before June. President Pavel a couple of days ago was saying that they would be ready within a week or so, as I understood it. Now it's June before they arrive. The F-16s aren't coming before July. Macron, as I said, is sending the French army in, or some of them, probably. He's been warned by the Russians about the risks of doing that. The Germans have ruled out sending their troops into Ukraine, and their relations with Macron have all but collapsed. The British, no condition to send troops to Ukraine. The Americans ruling it out for themselves, and probably that will stick, and I've explained why. We are heading in the West for a serious defeat in Ukraine, a massive defeat in Ukraine. The French military have pointed this out to Macron, and we have so mismanaged our relations with the Russians on the issue of Ukraine that the Russian position has now hardened to the point where I don't think that they are going to negotiate seriously at all. Anyway, there we are. That's my program for today. More from me soon. More in you can find, just the same, you can find more of our programs, all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you have all the amazing things there: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all the rest. And can I just say that we are now doing producing special St. Patrick's Day shirts. I know I've got many Irish friends. I know what an important event St. Patrick's Day is. We've got a whole series of St. Patrick's Day shirts that you can find on our shop. And last but not least, just to remind you all, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.